First, I like very much what you began with this uh, uh, grace, or whatever we call it, moment of happiness. Uh, and I would like to, would you agree that the same goes for love, I think? We have in
Beauty
English
too.
and they have it in French. I don't know if in other language they have it. They use the verb to fall in love, which means it's in this sense, in some sense, a fall. You are surprised, you are shocked. Authentic love, I think, is something very traumatic, even in this sense. I always like to use this example. Let's say you live a stupidly happy life. Maybe one night stand here and there, you drink with friends, then you fall in love passionately. This is, in some sense, a catastrophe for your life. All the balance is lost and
Yes,
so on.
yes,
You know.
yes.
Uh, so, uh, uh,
That's why Cupid has arrows.
sorry? Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. Uh,
That's a good point.
uh, but
It is, yeah.
That's a
where
point.
I first, second, surprisingly, maybe for you, I agree with your point about Judeo-Christian legacy, for which I am very much attacked, oh, Eurocentrist, and so on and so on. You know, I wonder if you would agree with it. I will try to condense it very much. You know what's for me the deepest, I simplify it to the utmost, something unheard of, and I, as an atheist, accept the spiritual value of it, happens in Christianity. In other religions, you have God up there, we fall from God, and then we try to climb back through spiritual discipline, whatever, training, good deeds, and so on and so on. The formula of Christianity is a totally different one. As we philosophers would have put it, uh, you don't climb to God. God, you are free in a Christian sense when you discover that the distance that separates you from God is inscribed into God Himself. That's why I agree with those intelligent theologists, like my favorite, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, who said that this the cross, the crucifixion, is something absolutely unique because in that moment of Eli, Eli, lama God, Father, why have you abandoned me? For a brief moment, symbolically, God Himself becomes an atheist in the sense of, you get a gap there. And that is something so absolutely unique. It means that you are not simply separated from God. Your separation from God is part of divinity itself. And we can then put it also in other terms, maybe closer to you, like that. Uh, that's why, for me, happiness is not some blissful unity with highest value. It's the very struggle, the fall, and so on. And that's why I hope we both worry about what will this possibility of so-called, I'm horrified with it,
Well,
what Ray Kurzweil calls singularity and this blissful state. I prefer not to know, but the final point, very brief. What I only don't quite get, why do you put so much access to this? We have to begin with a personal change. I mean, this is also the second or which
Probably
one,
number
I don't
two
remember,
highlight.
forgive me, of your slogans in your book. First set your house in order, then. But I have an extremely common sense, naive question here. But what if, in trying to set your house in order, you discover that your house is in disorder precisely because the way the society is messed up, which doesn't mean, okay, let's forget about my house. But you can do both at the same time. And I would even say, I will give you now the ultimate example yourself. Isn't it that you are so socially active because you realize that it's not enough to tell to your patients, set your house in order. Much of the reason of why they are in disorder, their house, is that there is some crisis in our society and so on and so on. So my reproach to you, benevolent, would have been, the joke, tea or coffee, yes, please. Like individual or social, yes, please, because this is obvious in extreme situation. Like, I hope we agree to say to somebody, in North Korea, set your house in order. No, haha. I mean, but I think in some deeper sense, it goes also for our societies. I'm just repeating what you are telling. You see some kind of a social crisis, and I don't see clearly why to insist so much on this choice. Because, sorry, just to finish, I will give you an example that I think perfectly does it. How do we usually deal with ecology? By this false personalization, they tell you, what did you do? Did you put all the Coke cans on the side? Did you recycle all paper? And so, yes, we should do this. But, in a way, this is also a very easy way to discharge yourself. You say, okay, I do the recycling, so up. I did my duty, let's go on. So just say, I choice there.
Okay, so, well, first of all, I have to point out that you have unfairly tasked me with 3 very difficult questions, and so I'm hoping that I can.
That's life. That's life. Yeah.
I just wanted to pause you very briefly. Because actually, this is one of the most innovative things I find about Žižek's work, and I'm writing about it in my new book, The Emergence of Postmodernity. So there's a plug for that coming out in a few months for those of you who are interested. But this kind of dialectical materialist interpretation of the history of Christianity and Christian thought, I think, is extremely innovative. And to a certain extent, people have accused Žižek of using it almost as a gag or a trope to kind of entice controversy, right? I mean, I remember he once described himself as a classical Christian Marxist, right? And people were like, oh, what is that? But this reading he has of the Christian tradition as, in some respects, fundamentally anti-Aristotelian in the sense of arguing for a universe that's entirely open-ended and ultimately defined by human freedom, which in turn explains why it is that alienation is such a permanent feature of human life, I think is, generally speaking, not only innovative, but broadly speaking, right. And I think it's a real testament to the fact that he's engaged in this kind of innovative work, that so many people have struggled to really think through the kind of dynamic that he's talking about. And that really shows you that you're onto something, to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, if anyone watching or listening is interested, especially the point about God himself in Christianity, the Christian God being divided, that it's God's distance from himself is what's reinforced there. He did a book with John Milbank, one of the radical orthodoxians, titled "The Monstrosity of Christ." But also, if people are interested, he illustrates this point through his discussion of Martin Scorsese's film, The Last Temptation of Christ.
Oh, that's a great film.
In The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. And it's pretty, I think he said afterwards that he didn't really want to do that part because he's not a big Scorsese fan. Actually, he said this was a state secret, but he said it on camera so everyone knows it. But he was like, Sophie finds the director like that point that he makes about, Christianity and God divided from himself. She wanted to make sure to get that in there. And so I guess he humored her and shot that, but it's well done if people are interested in watching it.
Absolutely. And I mean, just to the more political point, it's something that I mentioned the last time we had this discussion where I talked about Peterson's work, which is that fundamentally, from a Žižekian perspective, a lot of so-called Christian conservatives aren't really Christian. They're Aristotelians of one flavor or another who believe that God created this wonderful ordered universe and a divine nature, and we are not to fuck with it, basically. And one of the things that Hegel points out in his lectures on religion is that's actually really wrong. If you read, for instance, the book of Genesis, when we're cast out of Eden, it's not because God said they fucked up and unified nature. So there you go. He says it's because you've now picked of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. And so you're now like me in knowing good and evil. And so you have to participate in creation in the same way that I would, which is a very, very different philosophy than what you see espoused by Aristotle. for example. And I think it's really telling that people like Peterson just can't wean themselves off of this kind of stratified, naturalistic iteration of Christianity because it accords a lot more with this need to have a kind of hierarchical universe and to see any kind of break from that hierarchy as in some sense a signifier of decadence and decline inexorably.
Yeah,
rather than, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I mean, it is really funny. I mean, the more you think about this, like I mean, I understand, obviously, for a huge part of the history of the church, you know, like that kind of Aristotelianism, you know, is such a massive influence on the Christian intellectual tradition, you know, that it makes sense that it's all over the place still now. But it's also like really weird, like just sort of taken literally, because it's like, come on, guys. I mean, like this could not be further from that in some ways. I mean, this is literally a religious tradition that says that you know that God is made flesh and suffers, and, you know, I mean that could not be less of that sort of, you know, and that in identification with this suffering incarnate God, you know, all distinctions between, you know, Jew and Greek and man and woman and slave and free are sort of dissolved away in that, you know, like that's such a weird fit with that kind of like neat and tidy, you know, Aristotelian ordered hierarchical universe where everything is balanced and everything is exactly the way it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really hoping that there's a lot more work done on this. I'm trying to do my own small part, but because I think it's a really interesting kind of way trying to build bridges with a conservative Christian community that would likely be very hostile to things like radical theory through exploring the kind of latent radicalness within their own tradition, right? And I think he's very good at that.
Yeah.
I also think some of what you're talking about, you know, I mean, it might be, yeah. I mean, I like in a lot of ways, I'm a pretty, I'm actually like a pretty old-fashioned, you know, square, kind of, you know, old-fashioned atheist. But I also think that in terms of like, you know, views that people could have or work that people could do, I mean, some of what you're describing, like I think.
Did you once say that Martin Scorsese was God, Ben? I'm sure that I heard you say that.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, this is how far I am
Scorsese
on both topics, right? You know, I think there is no God and Martin Scorsese is his prophet, but in any case, I don't know, you know, or Coppola. Basically, I just like all the Italians, but in any case, I think, yeah, actually, I'm a giant Scorsese fan, but I think that like a lot of Jewish mysticism is about you know, like you know, God is divided, God in exile is being exiled from himself and things like that, you know. So, you know, I think there's probably something interesting to be written about that, you know, in connection with what you're talking about.
From what I can recall, I think we're past most of the like debate part of it. And I think by this point, Peterson is already starting to, well, he's already started to sort of actually listen to, to what Žižek is saying and is more interested. And I think, and this is to Peterson's credit, I think is more interested in sort of listening to him and having kind of a, you know, a discussion. There were all kinds of funny memes, I mean, leading up to, but then after as well. And I remember the day after, when Žižek, we went out to, we were getting lunch or something, and somebody, while I was sitting there, sent me one of the memes where Peterson has his laptop out, and it was like he was Googling who is Hegel, and there was just like a ton of those. But I do think that like a lot of the sort of body blows have already been landed. But it's still interesting to see how the dynamic between them, you know, plays out for the rest of it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I was actually thinking when Matt was saying that a minute ago about how, you know, there's relatively little, despite the announced topic, you know, there's relatively little marks, you know, it's just kind of a appetizer at the beginning. Just thinking, man, that is a good thing, because if there had been like, you know, even another 20 minutes of marks, this would be like part 7. Because
I know,
like the Marx claims, you know, where you know, Peterson is saying things that's like every 20 seconds. It's like, okay, sorry, can't let that go by. right? That's just not right.
I know. Thank God we didn't get to the, he didn't read the economic manuscripts, because we'd be here. Yeah. Part 13.
Man, can you just imagine like the sort of like, I think that might actually really bring out like the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 might really bring out like the most sort of deranged maps of meaning version of Jordan Peterson.
I want to see what version of Marx it brings out. I want to see what what apparently it says, but we'll have to wait.
Fair enough. All right, let's get started.
Actually is, and get the diagnosis right, and you've moved some small measure forward in addressing what might constitute the broader social concern. And what's even better, you're punished for your own goddamn mistakes. And that's another thing I like about the idea of working locally, is that, if I do broad scale social experiments and they fail, it's like, well, tough luck for the people for whom they failed. But if I'm experimenting on myself within the confines of my own relationship and I make a mistake, I'm going to feel the pain. And that's good, that's just, but it also gives me the possibility of learning. And so I believe that you do solve what you can about yourself first before you can set your family straight, and before you should dare to try to set the world straight. Otherwise, you degenerate into this kind of, you already talked about it, this shallow moralizing, well, I've divided my goddamn Coke cans up, and now I can spend more money on new packaging at the supermarket, which is exactly what the psychological research indicates that people do if they perform a casual moral action. They immediately justify committing a less moral action because they've put themselves in a higher moral place. And you might, if you were a real pessimist, you'd say, well, that's why they performed the action to begin with. I think that's often true. That's associated with that shallow moralizing.
Are we too much in this direction, or again, I will put in my Stalinist terms, would you go as far as to say, who needs the people? We talk for the people, and we know better than the people. No, because I don't want to take too much of the time for the public, but you know what interests me? Would you then agree, because this is how Hegel reads the story of the fall, that fall really is felix culpa, in the sense that for Hegel, before the fall, we are simply animals. It's through the fall that you perceive goodness as what will drag you out of the fall. So in this sense, fall is constitutive of the very, it's not you fall from goodness. You fall, and that's the dialectical paradox. Your fall retroactively creates what you fell from, as it were. And that's the tough lesson for cheap moralists to accept. But where I see, very briefly, maybe a counter question. What fascinates me, I didn't cover this, but speaking about ideology, would you agree? What fascinates me more and more is not big ideology in the sense of projects and so on. In our cynical era, people claim, oh, we no longer take them seriously and so on. But, and here, for me, social dimensions enters even our intimate space. Implicit beliefs, ideological presuppositions, why not, which we embody in our most common daily practices. For example, probably some of you already know it, I will nonetheless repeat a very shortened version. I was occupied at some point by the structure of toilets in Western Europe. I noticed this specificity of German toilets, where, the shit doesn't disappear in water. It is there exposed so that you smell it and control it for whatever. And I immediately associated it with German spirit of poetry and reflection and so on. It's a bad joke. But what I'm saying is that, in a sense, and I've spoken with some specialists, I was so intrigued by how do you construct toilets, and they
actually, I want to say something I think that's actually pretty significant. Well, because one of the things that's interesting about Žižek and Peterson is Peterson is actually much more beholden to a kind of classical theory of ideology than Žižek is. And you see this in his recent book, Beyond Order, right? Where one of the rules is, don't buy into ideology or something like that characterization. And his conception of ideology is just, frankly, a big, giant meta-narrative, what we would conventionally call ideology in the kind of vulgar Marxist tradition. The ruling stream of thought at any given time, or at least one operative stream of thought that happens to have a tremendous amount of social significance at any given time. And what I really like about Žižek's approach to ideology is he often compares it to the John Carpenter movie They Live, where the protagonist has on a pair of glasses and he's able to see through all the messages and coding in his everyday life. Because what's really radical about his approach is this idea that various kinds of mythologizations and naturalizations are latent in virtually everything that we do. So our normal existence is an anti-ideological, and then we just assume a kind of ideological framework when we're trying to think about big picture issues. Our natural framework is to think about things in ideological terms, and it's a really concerted and difficult effort to wean yourself off of that. And what I think is interesting is, of course, you could develop a very individualistic ethics of the kind that Peterson is talking about through a Žižekian lens. But of course, if you were to take that approach and were to be critical of the different ways ideology interpolates you and frames your way of understanding the world in everyday life, that would have radical political consequences, right? Just like in the movie They Live, when what is it, Keith Sutherland? He takes the movie off, the glasses off, and all of a sudden he wants to overthrow the aliens.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Žižek's theory of ideology, I think, is really, 50, 60 years from now, I think that, who knows? I think his reading of Hegel is going to be one of the things that he's remembered for. But that like sustained critique of ideology that he's still, doing throughout his work. But that's one major concept. And, it's interesting, Matt, because I haven't read the new Peterson book. But it's interesting.
Not as good as the last one.
Okay.
Better or worse,
It's interesting to hear you say that he has a sort of theory of ideology, but insofar as he says, don't fall for ideology.
Don't believe ideology. Good luck with that.
Yeah, and I just think like that's something that from Žižek coming from this Hegelian Marxist tradition, like that would not pass as a definition or understanding of ideology. And so I think that's they don't really get into it here, but that's one of the ways to, I think, differentiate their thought at a more basic, even like structural level. What's influencing the kind of observations that he's making that go to like on the level of national toilets, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I guess I just think whatever. I mean, it's something that I think if you've read some Žižek, because he's very good on this, and and just if you've kind of thought about it, people who think that they're just sort of completely seeing everything the way that it is, because they're just they're pure pragmatists who are who are totally free from any sort of ideological assumptions of any kind. I mean, that's like just the most pure, uncut, you have to snort 2 specks of it to get high kind of ideology that you could possibly have.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw somebody on Twitter the other day, which is always where I go for the most reflective thoughts on the planet, right? And somebody who seemed like an alt-right guy, he had the Pepe meme, was sitting there being like, why do we have to continuously see things through, quote, lenses? Why don't we just see the world the way that it really is?
Yeah, why not?
And make our decisions based on that? That's like, it's true, Ever since Socrates and Plato, we've all just been too lazy to recognize cold, hard reality. And it's long past time we got rid of all this nonsense and just became real men, appreciating the world in a firm, realistic way, right?
Yeah, we totally know what that is.
Yeah. The claim to realism is often the most, it seems like the most modest, but it's often the most, what's the term I'm looking for here? Well, I mean, I could just say immodest claim, right? That not only the ability to be able to see reality just how it is, but that you're the one who can do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I find so frustrating, right? Because the same people who assert that we should just be cold hard realists often don't really have a very good account of what it would even mean to be realists. More or less, it just typically means people who think like me, since of course I know objectively how things actually are. And it's a pretty vain outlook, right? And I'm not saying that Peterson adopts that view, since I think his own epistemology is a bit more sophisticated than that. But I think that there's a lot of good that something like Žižekian ideology analysis can do for these kinds of outlooks, by showing that, look, there really is no unfiltered way of looking at reality. That certainly, and if you are going to even talk about something like the real, it's going to require an awful lot of philosophical hard thinking in order to get you there.
Yeah, and I mean, I've got to say, I guess you're sort of saying this, but like, even Peterson at his best is a little bit better than that. Like, just having it be one of your rules for bullet life, just don't believe ideology, would suggest, right? Like that. I'm thinking about his like some of his exchanges with Sam Harris, where like some of them were really bad, like on Peterson's end. Like there's a like the initial thing where they're talking about truth and, you know, whether something can be true even if it's not conducive to species survival or whatever, and like that's honestly like probably the most sympathetic I've ever been to Sam Harris ever, you know, is watching him, like, you know, argue with Jordan Peterson about that. But if you read, it's available online, some of you know, I think Peterson's notes on this, I think he did like after that initial exchange with Harris, where he's talking about, like, he's sort of criticizing Harris for the right reason, for, you know, for thinking that, you know, you can generate values, you know, from facts unassisted. And I will say that whereas I don't think that Peterson gets the basic Hume point about that, at least some of the other points that he's making are still like good and also relevant to why that's such a silly rule. Like Peterson does say things like in those notes, like it's impossible to perceive facts without, you know, a sort of mechanism that's shaped by your values, you know, determining what facts you're paying attention to in the first place, and, you know, stuff like that. And, you know, he's making, again, I don't think the sort of central point he should make about that, because I don't think he gets that central point, but he is making some very good points about it, and ones that I think show that maybe, you know, in his more reflective moments when he's not dishing out rules for life 12 at a time, you know, like he maybe understands at least some of the reasons why it doesn't really make sense to talk that way.
Absolutely. I noticed somebody in the chat say something that I think it's actually worth dwelling on for a little while, which is that it's by Nathan Drake. I've noticed that conservatives love to claim that they are realists by appealing to common sense. And actually, I think that's a good observation. And I think it's worth dwelling on this because, in a certain sense, conservatives are more realistic than a lot of progressives. To the extent that they're defending the status quo or existing systems of power relations, they can claim to be defending society as it really is right now, right? The problem that progressive takes is that the reality that we live in right now is deeply unjust and has a lot of flaws. And the other point that we'd like to make is that just because something is this way at the given moment doesn't mean it has to be that way. It could be a different way. And this kind of appeal to common sense is usually just a rhetorical trick to try to suggest that there's something permanent, enduring, and ineradicable about our way of organizing things right now, which is really not true. And I think going back to somebody like Socrates criticizing, you know, Athenian doxa, the job of a genuinely critical theory and philosophy is to upend common sense in the name of justice, right? And I also think this relates back to Peterson's kind of outlook, because a lot of what he says has a kind of folksy appeal to it. You know, clean your room before, you know, you try to change the world. And it does sound like common sense because it's down to earth, practical, and it seems like something that's achievable for different individuals. But like we said before, what's notable about this kind of appeal to folksy common sense is how depoliticized it is. And again, that's not a coincidence, because suggesting that if your problem with your employer is really drastic, you should just quit and change and move to a different job. That depoliticizes what could ultimately become a campaign to try to change things in the workplace, or even change the mode of production per se, right? So that's another way in which these appeals to common sense are a way of deflecting from the kind of political dimensions of social reality by saying that we should just manage our problems individually rather than trying to change existing power structures. And I think that's another element of this appeal that we should reject very emphatically.